After witnessing a horrific crime, a high school teacher suffers from disturbing hallucinations, making her believe that she is the killer's next target. In an expansive manner in the English countryside, Cass sits on the bedroom floor while laying out tarot cards. Suddenly, a crow flies directly into the glass pane window. The next day, the high school English literature teacher tells her students to enjoy their term break. After class, one eager pupil, Andrew, walks Cass out and asks how she plans on spending her break. The woman says she and her husband are renovating their house. Then, the teen asks if her husband's also American, so she explains that he's a half-British expat just like her. She adds that her best friend is the same because their mothers both married Americans. Before Andrew heads on his way, Cass tells him to read his assigned book during the break. Then, a fellow teacher, John, asks the woman if she'll join him and their colleagues for a drink. She says yes and that she'll meet them at the inn. That night, Cass politely declines the man's offer to drive her home despite the oncoming storm. In the car, the teacher answers a call from her husband who says he's too exhausted to wait for her, so she tells him to go to bed and promises she won't take the road through the woods as per his request. However, after nearly getting run off the road by a large truck, Cass decides to drive through BlackwaterLane anyway. Suddenly, she happens upon a vehicle by the side of the road. She stops for a few seconds and sees a woman in the driver's seat. At first, she contemplates checking on the woman but ultimately chooses to continue driving home. The next day, Cass's husband Matthew informs her that the cops found a dead woman in her car on BlackwaterLane. She doesn't disclose that she drove down the road last night and then heads to the bathroom. Inside, she watches a news report on her phone and wonders if the victim is the same woman she saw inside the stranded car. Later, Cass tells Matthew that they need to find a new contractor soon because she's tired of all the plastic sheets hanging in their house. When he expresses slight exasperation that she's spending the day with Rachel, she calmly reminds him that the woman's her best friend. At the restaurant, Rachel jokingly teases that John has a crush on the teacher, so Cass says her colleague has a girlfriend. Then she asks the woman to be nicer to Matthew, implying a strained relationship between the best friend and husband. Eventually, Rachel says it's her job to be overprotective, especially with how vulnerable Cass has been since her mother's passing. Later, the blonde gives the brunette a tea towel from her latest work trip and says she got one for herself as per their tradition. Cass finds a framed picture of when she did theater 10 years ago, then mentions her agent called her about an audition. She admits that she misses the stage, but Matthew discourages her because they're trying for a baby. After lunch, the teacher says they need to buy Susie's birthday gift, so the confused friend reminds her that they pooled their money because she said she'd purchased the present. Cass swears she doesn't remember that happening, so Rachel said it occurred when they were at Hannah's house. That afternoon, the woman sees a person wearing a baseball cap standing outside their house. Suddenly, Matthew appears, but when she mentions what she saw, the person's no longer there. The husband thinks she just has an overactive imagination, but she insists she didn't make it up. At Susie's party, Rachel tells Cass that because she was on a work trip, she just found out that the murder victim on BlackwaterLane, Jane Walters, worked for the same company she does. After hearing the name, the teacher remembers that she met the deceased at a party a few weeks ago and even exchanged contact information. Cass spots John amongst the guests, so the celebrant, Susie, says he's her tennis coach. Moments later, the woman introduces her colleague to Matthew. In the bed, the husband shows Cass the picture police released of the victim, and she immediately recognizes Jane. She wonders who could have wanted the woman dead, and the man thinks it was a random killing. Concerned, the teacher tells Matthew that they need to upgrade their outdated security system. When the man goes to check if all the doors are locked, the woman answers a call, but all she hears is static. The next day, Cass watches a news report mentioning that the police established an anonymous tip line for any information regarding Jane's murder. Then she hears a noise from behind the plastic sheets in the living room, but unbeknownst to her, a mysterious stranger lurks in the shadows. The teacher quickly locks the door. Then when she answers her phone in the kitchen, she hears the same static and a person's breathing on the other end. Seconds later, the doorbell rings, so she lets the security system technician inside the house. After sensing a strange vibe from the man, Cass tells him to come back when her husband's home. That afternoon, the woman heads to the spot where Jane's car was found and sees flowers and notes by the side of the road. A few feet away, she finds a familiar earring and picks it up. Suddenly, a fox pops out of the bushes, prompting the woman to head back to her car. Later, Cass rifles through her belongings and confirms that the earring she found at the crime scene matches the lone piece inside her box. That evening, while she takes a relaxing bath, the teacher submerges her entire body in the water. Then, she feels someone holding her down, so she thrashes because she is unable to breathe. However, when Cass finally emerges from the water, she finds that there's no one in the bathroom with her. The terrified woman calls Matthew, but when he suggests informing the police, she tells him not to and that he just needs to come home immediately. Minutes later, she answers the door for Detective Constable or DC Lawson and assumes her husband called the cops. However, the officers explained that they're there because someone called the tip line and told them the teacher was at BlackwaterLane the night of the murder. Perplexed as to how anyone knew this information, Cass admits she was about to call the tip line but hadn't had the nerve to do so yet. During the interview, the woman shares that even though she could tell the person in the vehicle was a woman, it was raining too hard for her to make out Jane's face. She adds that the person didn't look like they needed any help, which is why she drove away. Later that night, Cass sees the open kitchen window and says she's certain she made sure all the doors and windows were locked before her bath. Matthew brushes off her concern and admonishes the wife for failing to tell him that she drove down the forest road that night, so she reasons that she knew he'd get angry and it would have led to an argument. Exasperated, the husband says they'll need to finish installing the security system before his week-long trip. Surprised, Cass doesn't remember him saying anything about the work trip, so he reminds her that he told her 3 weeks ago. The next day, the woman calls her best friend who promises she can stay over tonight. Later, the teacher receives another anonymous call. As she's about to leave, Andrew arrives to return a book he finished reading. She asks how the student knew her address, and he says his classmate Harry Freeman lives nearby. Cass heads to the school where she runs into John, who's there giving tennis lessons over the break. He shares that he used to play tennis with Jane, but they had to stop because the woman's husband Alex grew jealous of them spending time together. As the man walks her out, she asks if he's still going to Greece for his vacation, but he reveals that he and his girlfriend broke up. That evening, Rachel calls Cass to tell her that she can't make it because she's still with a client. Minutes later, the teacher sees a dark figure, and in her haste, she runs and entangles into the plastic sheets and falls to the floor. She suffocates on the constricting material but manages to tear it off just in time. In her room, the terrified woman sees her tarot cards laid out on the table. Then she receives another call from the unknown number, causing her to fearfully break down in tears. Hours later, Cass hears a ghostly voice calling her name from the hallway. When the specter appears to move toward her, the scared teacher runs and locks herself in the closet. As she hears breaking glass on the other side, she calls the police. Later, DC Lawson informs the station they didn't find an intruder in the house, nor did they find any broken glass. Then, her partner relays the information that Cass was admitted to a psychiatric hospital 2 years ago. Because she can't be in the house all alone, the teacher chose to stay at a nearby hotel. John joins her for lunch and she tells him that Matthew's still on a worksite visit and can't come home yet. She thinks everything that's happening to her feels like it's connected to Jane, although she thinks it might be Andrew, whom she believes has a crush on her. When she mentions the student saying Harry Freeman lives near their manor, the man says Andrew lied because the Freemans live on the other side of town. Later, while on a stroll, John leans in for a kiss, but Cass politely shoots down his attempt. When Matthew finally returns from his trip, he asks his wife if she's still taking the medication she started when her mother died, adding that the hallucinations might be a side effect. While on the bed, the woman asks to see the contract with the security system company she apparently signed, because she swears she'd never decide without consulting with her husband first. However, Matthew says that all he knows is he stopped by the house this morning and the technician said his boss and Cass set today as the installation. The teacher remembers a different conversation, but when she asks to see the contract, the husband says he'll show it to her later and that they should enjoy the night. Later, the pair make love, and after the man falls asleep, Cass sneakily checks the contract and sees her signature. While the woman tends to her plants in the conservatory, Matthew appears and relays the disturbing information that the killer slashed Jane's throat with a knife. Then, DC Lawson stops by to ask if the husband can corroborate his wife's story that she came home at 11:45 p.m. that night. The man says he was already asleep, and when the cop finds it weird that he slept in the guest room, Cass explains that he chooses to do so sometimes because she snores. One morning, the teacher finds a note by the front door from Jane's husband Alex, thanking her for the flowers and inviting her to their house for a visit anytime. Later, Cass tells Rachel that she's thinking about moving out of the house, and the latter says she wouldn't blame her if she did after everything that's happened. That afternoon, she visits Alex, and when he shares his theory that his late wife was having an affair, stating John as a possible lover, the woman assures him that Jane adored him and would never cheat. The next day, a stroller arrives at the house, causing Matthew to assume that his wife's pregnant. However, Cass swears she isn't and that she never ordered the item. She theorizes that the seller must have gotten confused when she bought a sleeping suit for Susie's new baby. Concerned, the man thinks it's time she sees her psychiatrist. In Dr. Deacon's office, the physician mentions the possibility of the woman having early onset dementia just like her late mother. Meanwhile, Alex speaks to DC Lawson and says his conversation with Cass reminded him of his wife mentioning someone she knew having an affair. That night, night, the teacher sees her mother's face in the TV static. When she looks for Matthew in the kitchen, she finds a bloody knife on the counter. Then, she runs into the man in the hallway, but when they check, the blade's no longer there. The next day, Cass hears a baby's cries outside and she follows it to a bundle of cloth in the yard. To her horror, she finds a dead crow inside, so she runs back into the house and ingests her medication. When the woman wakes up, she's in the hospital. The doctor and her husband explain that she took too many pills, but she insists she only took 2. Finally back home, Matthew heads out to grab some food, then the lights suddenly start flickering. Terrified, Cass hears the doorbell, and when she sees that it's DC Lawson, asks if she saw flickering too, but the cop says no. The police officer says she dropped by because she received a report that the woman tried taking her own life. So the teacher clarifies that she's taken anti-anxiety medication since her mother passed, and this time she must have miscalculated. Then the cop says they received another tip and asks if Cass ever returned to the crime scene. So the teacher shows her the earring she found and that she believes it's hers. When asked why she never told the authorities about it, the woman admits she didn't know what to do in the moment. Later, DC Lawson mentions the locals still call the manor the Old Crawford House, and that Rachel's middle name happens to be Crawford as well. Cass says it isn't a coincidence because her best friend's grandfather was part of a financial fraud scheme and had to sell everything he owned, including the manor. The cop asks how Rachel feels about the teacher's family buying the house, and she says the friend was very supportive. Later that night, the teacher reads a letter from the psychiatrist suggesting she undergo further testing to rule out early onset dementia. The next day, she calls the security system company to ask for a copy of the signed contract. That afternoon, the woman stops by Susie's place and she learns that Rachel had an affair with Jane's best friend's husband, and this information conflicts with the blonde woman's claim that she barely knew the deceased. That evening, Cass nearly gets run off the road when a black SUV repeatedly slams into her vehicle. However, when she reports the incident to a police officer, Matthew says the damage on her car was from last week and she must have forgotten, just like the multiple times her memories failed her in the last few weeks. The next day, Amy from the security system company calls the teacher to inform her that she sent the wrong contract yesterday. When the woman asks when she supposedly signed the second contract, Amy says the installation day. Cass finds the information odd because she's certain she was at the hotel. After the call, the woman finds the fox's carcass on the lawn. Later, she meets Rachel for lunch and shares that Matthew's cold treatment lately leads her to believe that he's having an affair. The blonde says she'll send her a trusted private investigator's information and adds that she's never trusted the husband. Then, the teacher asks the friend if she's ever had an affair, but the latter gives a vague answer. When Rachel goes to the restroom, Cass hears another phone ringing from the woman's bag and takes it. That evening, the teacher reads through the messages and learns that her best friend and husband are having an affair and that the woman killed Jane because she caught them doing the deed in the office. She also finds out that Rachel was the one calling the anonymous tip line because she saw Cass's car on BlackwaterLane that night. Then she searches the conservatory and finds the bloody knife wrapped in the tea towel her best friend gave her. Heartbroken and distraught, the teacher ingests multiple tablets and slashes her wrists with a blade. Hours later, Andrew stops by the house, but when no one answers, he peeks through the window and sees the woman lifelessly lying on the couch. He calls the police, so DC Lawson contacts Matthew to relay the unfortunate news. When the husband arrives, the student explains what he saw and that his wife didn't survive the trip to the hospital. Later that night, Rachel and Matthew return to the house to find the phone. Suddenly, they see Cass's bloody figure behind a plastic sheet, and when the blonde hears someone running away, she tries to follow. Seconds later, John appears and attacks the husband. A scuffle ensues, but just before the teacher incapacitates Matthew, Rachel knocks him out with a blow to the head. Outside, the unhinged couple chases after Cass, who's been alive this whole time. Eventually, the women engage in a heated fight by the pond. The teacher manages to straddle her opponent and hold her head down in the water, but the husband appears and knocks his wife out. Later, when the woman finally regains consciousness, Rachel tries to gaslight her by saying that the phone is hers and that she's been having an affair with John, and that she's suffering from a mental illness. Eventually, the best friend expresses her deep disdain for Cass, stating that she chose to live in her family's old house to humiliate her and that she she always flaunts all the money she inherited. She adds that the brunette knew the financial woes she went through while they were in school and never said a word. So the teacher clarifies that her mother helped her friend's mother and she chose not to say anything because she knew it'd embarrass her. Cass slowly walks toward Rachel and confronts her for causing all the damage despite everything her family did for her. Enraged, the blonde tries to stab the woman, but Matthew intercepts and he suffers the injury instead. Suddenly, the police arrive, and Rachel continues telling the story that Cass stabbed her husband. However, DC Lawson called the university where they graduated and found out that the best friend knew Matthew even before the man and the teacher met. She orchestrated the plan with her lover and introduced them to the unsuspecting teacher at an expat event. Rachel insists they don't have a case because she was on a work trip, but the cop says she checked the flight manifest and she was never on the plane to New York. Days later, Cass tells Alex everything that happened. John fully recovered from his injuries, but Matthew eventually perished from his. Rachel admitted that following the teacher's mental breakdown from her mother's death, she and Matthew orchestrated the plan to make it appear as though the woman had early onset dementia, hoping it'd drive her to take her own life. However, Jane caught them in the office, so Rachel killed the woman and made Cass look like the suspect by placing her earring at the crime scene. The teacher had her suspicions when she noticed how eager her husband was to talk about her dementia, and she now realizes they rigged the house to create the haunting images that would remind her of her mother. When she found the hidden camera, she recruited John, DC Lawson, and Andrew. She knew Rachel and Matthew were always watching and that they'd want the knife and the phone, so she used fake blood to make it appear as though she had taken her own life. After everything that's happened, Cass admits she still misses Rachel and Matthew, even though she now knows that he never loved her. Despite the harrowing experience, the woman knows for certain that she's much stronger than she ever thought.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.